Hello everyone, and welcome to the Dublin Festival of History 2024. A very warm welcome to Kieran Connell for this talk, No Blacks, No Irish, No Dogs, the Irish in Multicultural Britain. Before we start, I'd like to inform all our audience members that this session is being recorded and will be available to view on YouTube after the festival. You can also switch on closed caption option during this Zoom. In this hour-long talk, writer and historian Kieran Connell sheds new light on the experiences of the hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants who made lives for themselves in Britain over the second half of the 20th century. Drawing on his book, Multicultural Britain, A People's History, Connell explores the discrimination the Irish experienced and how this compared to the racism that was faced by other formerly colonised people. We will have a Q&A at the end and questions in the Q&A box only, and I'll put them forward at the end. Now, I'll pass you over to Kieran. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Tamsin. Thank you very much for having me. It's a wonderful privilege to be able to talk to you today, even if the format does bring back some bad memories of what we were all up to this time 4 years ago. As you can see, and as Tamsin mentioned, the focus of my talk today is going to be my just published book, Multicultural Britain, A People's History, which is a very personal book indeed for me. Its starting point is my reflections on what it was like to grow up as one of only 3 or 4 white children at a primary school in Borsall Heath, an inner city area of Birmingham that became infamous as one of the many so-called twilight zones that attracted successive generations of immigrants from Britain's colonies and former colonies in the period after the Second World War. What I tried to show in the book is the way these patterns of migration and settlement over a period of decades transformed British society, and indeed Britishness itself, into a diverse, hybrid entity, even as racism remained, and to this day remains, very much firmly in place. And of course, the latter was something that we saw play out in spectacular fashion in the racist rioting that engulfed cities across the UK, including here in Belfast, from where I'm talking to you today in the August just gone. The book is also a personal one because immigration is part of my own family story. My maternal great-grandparents, James and Susanna Connell, moved to Britain from County Cork in the early 20th century. Most of the other white children at school in Borsall Heath were also the descendants of migrants, whether from Ireland, Eastern Europe, or from elsewhere. That's me there, a photograph of me on my 11th birthday, and for my sins, yes, I am the one with the Liverpool soccer shirt in the background there. We sat in classrooms and played in playgrounds with the more common demographic of children whose parents had come from places like Pakistan in the Indian subcontinent, Yemen in the Middle East, and Somalia in the Horn of Africa. That experience left a lasting impression on me. It would be entirely wrong to frame it as a kind of happy-go-lucky melting pot that was devoid of social friction and economic disadvantage. During the latter part of the 20th century, Borsall Heath was infamous for its poor quality housing, predatory landlords, and a sex industry that rivaled London's Soho and King's Cross areas. Even by the time I attended school there in the 1990s, Borsall Heath was estimated to be in the 15% most deprived neighbourhoods in Britain and had an unemployment rate of 35%. But there was a kind of rough and ready familiarity with ethnic diversity, a sense that cultural or ethnic diversity was neither spectacular nor a source of anxiety, but rather something ordinary and even banal. So my first kiss, for example, was with a girl called Bushra. She had hazelnut eyes, her hair was concealed beneath a hijab, and her parents were from the Yemen. My best friend at the time was Sufyan, whose parents were from Pakistan and whose father showed me how Urdu is read from right to left as opposed to left to right. Sufyan, like many of my friends, would sometimes miss school at Eid, while other friends celebrated Diwali and wore their hair in a patka or top knot. We even spoke in our own kind of language, a kind of multicultural slang that mixed up Punjabi swear words, Jamaican patois, and the local Brummie idiom. This was not the kind of state-sponsored multiculturalism that has so often been a source of controversy in Britain. Rather, we might think of it as actually existing multiculturalism, a social reality whereby as the Jamaican cultural theorist Stuart Hall has put it, ethnic diversity has become a natural and inevitable part of the scene, despite continued hostility towards immigration and the persistent threat of racial violence. The Irish now have a very particular place within this milieu. They were, of course, one of the longest standing minority groups in Britain and consistently the largest immigrant demographic. As late as 1961, encouraged by the adverts for work in Britain that were a near ever-present feature of newspapers across Ireland, there were more than 644,000 Irish immigrants in England and 58,000 Irish immigrants in Birmingham alone. That number represented more than half of all overseas immigrants living in the city. Indeed, by 1965, it was estimated that 1 in 6 births in Birmingham was coupled with at least one Irish-born parent. At this time, it was estimated that 1/6 of the entire population of Ireland was living in Britain. The signs that were posted on the windows of bed and breakfasts and pubs in Birmingham, London, Manchester, and other areas of immigrant settlement, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, have come to symbolise the extent to which the vitriolic racism that often greeted Black and Asian migrants in this period was often matched by anti-Irish sentiment. For Black migrants as well as Irish, this sign in particular has become a leitmotif that is made to symbolise the spectrum of discrimination faced by ethnic minorities across the second half of the 20th century. But while this chimes with an important part of the Irish sensibility, we must also tread carefully. To some degree, like their Caribbean, South Asian or African counterparts, the way the Irish were treated in Britain was conditioned by the legacies of the racial fictions that underpinned the imperial project, but for one obvious yet critical factor. The Irish were white, and as such could sidestep the unavoidable visibility that came from what the Martinican theorist and anti-colonial activist Frantz Fanon called the fact of blackness. The implications of this are crystallised by the reality that when in 1962 the British government introduced the first legislation designed to restrict immigration following an outbreak of racist rioting in London and Nottingham, the Irish were exempt from the measures. As one government minister explained to his colleagues behind the scenes, the restrictions were designed to operate on, quote, coloured people almost exclusively. By focusing on 1960s Balsall Heath, what I want to do in today's talk is think about a really important and hone in on a really important moment in this story. So 1960s Balsall Heath is the very same area that I myself went to school some 30 years later. But the 1960s was the moment, I think, that the roots of both the familiarity with diversity I described earlier on and the ongoing controversies and anguish around issues like immigration that still dominate the British political debate can be found. It's well known that the 1948 British Nationality Act, passed by Clement Attlee's Labour government, was a key legislative marker in giving citizens of Britain's colonies and former colonies the equal right to live and work in the one-time imperial mother country. The Act was passed for politically expedient reasons, and few in government anticipated that it would contribute towards a permanent and expanding ethnic minority presence in Britain. By the 1960s, however, there was a belated recognition that Britain's migrant presence was indeed there to stay. In the context of an increasingly influential anti-immigrant lobby, the first steps had already been taken to limit the ability of immigrants from Britain's now former colonies to enter into the country in the shape of the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act. But in the short term, at least, this legislation actually had the opposite impact to what was intended. It forced those immigrants who were already in Britain to make a decision. They could return home, as many had often initially intended to do, and reunite with family members, many of whom would soon be prevented from settling into Britain. But this would generally mean doing so without having made the fortune that immigrants often hoped they'd make. The alternative was to stop thinking of themselves as temporary guests in Britain and start imagining themselves as permanent settlers. And it was the latter option that many people decided to take. In 1967, the number of immigrants in Britain from the Caribbean, East Africa, and the Indian subcontinent had reached 50,000 people, almost double what it had been in 1961. In order to beat the ban, which remember did not apply to the Irish, men who had often initially migrated by themselves had arranged for wives, children, girlfriends, and other family members to join them. They began looking into the possibility of purchasing homes that would be big enough to fit their families in, and they set up businesses that they hoped could one day pay for them. By 1966, Balsall Heath had the largest concentration of immigrants of any neighbourhood in Birmingham, with a quarter of Balsall Heath residents having been born in the so-called New Commonwealth. In light of this, the media often referred to Balsall Heath as Birmingham's, quote, coloured colony. Yet in many ways, what was happening in Balsall Heath was paradigmatic of a broader set of changes that, within a matter of decades, would affect similar neighbourhoods the length and breadth of the country. And contrary to the often hysterical narratives that could be found in the media's reporting on such areas, which often drew on long-standing anxieties around the supposed hypersexuality of black men in particular, it is possible to see in this period a growing familiarity with increasing ethnic diversity, something hinted at through quotidian encounters on Balsall Heath streets, in its front gardens, and inside cafes and other sites of leisure. This was taking place just as the steady permeation of social racism was being amplified by figures like the Wolverhampton MP and future MP for South Down, Enoch Powell, who in spring 1968 delivered his notorious anti-immigration Rivers of Blood speech in a central Birmingham hotel. The terms multicultural, and I think especially multiculturalism, have been contentious in Britain almost from the moment that they were imported from the United States in the mid-1970s. In many ways, in Britain, across Europe, and increasingly here in Ireland too, they've become watchwords used by commentators to encapsulate everything that is understood to be wrong with the allowances made by governments for the presence of increasingly diverse populations. The aim I have in my book is to move the conversation on from the question of policy responses to ethnic diversity and instead consider the multicultural from the point of view of a social reality, a dynamic whereby different cultural communities live together and attempt to build a common life while retaining something of their original identities. This is a process which is happening across Ireland as we speak right now. The advantage of considering the multicultural objectively is that it allows us to adopt an expanded historical lens that takes in the experience of different ethnic communities. As we will see today, racism is a central and unavoidable part of this story, but a focus on the multicultural also allows us to probe how this intersects with the experience of other marginalised groups, including the Irish. What such an approach allows us to get at, I argue today, is what we might think of as street-level multiculturalism and the complicated, often unruly process of immigrant communities moving towards a greater degree of permanence. Throughout the 1960s, the inner areas of Britain's major cities were more accurately slums. In 1967, more than 60% of residents of Balsall Heath lacked the exclusive use of either a hot tap or a toilet, while the area's topography still bore the wartime scars inflicted by the German bombing campaigns, which had targeted the city's motor and munitions factories. So as we can see from these stunning photographs which were taken by the American postgraduate student Janet Mendelsohn between 1967 and 1969, which I discuss at length in the book, the neighbourhood's housing stock was indeed decaying, as you can see from this picture. Children are literally playing with the bricks that are crumbling from a garden wall. It was also in the process of being monetised by exploitative landlords. More than 21% of households in Balsall Heath were classified as being overcrowded, and up to 6 families could often be found occupying a single house. One resident described the impression that decay had worked its way into the walls of houses in Balsall Heath, with damp having made the mortar bulge in the shape of half melons. But in the popular fantasy, the ethnically diverse communities who now inhabited Britain's inner cities had become indelibly associated with the dilapidation of the geography around them. And this was fused with a potent nostalgia for the supposed respectability of these areas in a bygone, more simplistic time, before the suffering and social changes brought about by the Second World War, and, by extension, before the arrival of widespread ethnic diversity. The Balsall Heath of the 1960s was a locus for journalists who seemed to be drawn to the neighbourhood's potential for voyeuristic narratives of sex and immorality, as if like moths to a light. One reporter described a walk through the area as a salutary experience, with rowdy crowds assembled at street corners and men accosted by sex workers as many as 5 times on a single outing. The streets themselves were seen as both mean and dirty, in marked contrast to the Balsall Heath of the pre-war years, which was supposedly a good-class area full of respectable people who resided in the imposing homes that once belonged to the Victorian middle class. While there might be a few such residents left, one commentator remarked, something has happened in the last few years to make them reluctant to admit that they live in Balsall Heath. That something was, of course, the growth of the area's immigrant population and all the associated problems that these communities were understood to bring. Echoing the colonial motifs often deployed by reporters in an earlier period, journalists explained that immigrants had arrived unprepared and unsuited to, quote, the British way of life. The immigrant presence had supposedly transformed Balsall Heath into a ghetto along American lines. With 1 in 4 people in the area now from the new Commonwealth and 13% of local residents Irish, once well-to-do residences had become disreputable centres of vice. By the 1960s, prostitutes could be brazenly seen soliciting at all hours of the day by standing in gardens or doorways, posing at windows, and even cruising around in cars. But one onlooker suggested that, in fact, there was little need for solicitation. As night fell, queues of men supposedly formed outside the brothels. These stereotypes had a symbiotic relationship with the everyday racism that faced Black and Asian immigrants in particular in their professional and social lives. As important as the media's role was in creating this climate of hostility towards the ethnic minority presence, one academic felt moved to remind reporters that immigrants didn't bring the slums with them brick by brick in their airline suitcases. It was the steady drip of aggressions that arguably constituted an even more damaging problem. Graffiti with slogans such as, quote, blacks go home, keep Africa black, keep Britain white, and, following Enoch Powell's incendiary 1968 speech, Enoch was right, are a recurring feature of film footage in the city in this period, and acted as daily reminders of the hostility that was potentially around every corner. Then, there was the animosity that could characterise personal relationships. In The Colony, for example, the filmmaker Philip Donlan's 1964 documentary about the Black experience in Birmingham, Stan Crook, an immigrant from St Kitts who worked as a signalman for British Rail, painted a picture of British racism as a fundamentally duplicitous entity. He saw his white colleagues daily. They would discuss issues relating to the job. They'd travel on the same trains. But any trace of amenability would leave as soon as that train arrived at a station. At this point, Crook explained, all confab ends. We don't even walk 10 yards together on the station platform. This was the kind of discrimination whereby invitations from colleagues to go for a cigarette break or a drink after work never materialised. Or, if you invited your white colleagues to your home for dinner, they simply did not show up. For another Black interviewee interviewed by Donlan, who was himself of Irish heritage, such interactions were daily reminders that, on a fundamental level, he would always be perceived as a stranger in Britain. To the mind of most white people, the interviewee concluded, the very concept of a Black Britain was like trying to mix water with oil. This discrimination extended to other, less immediately visible immigrant communities in Birmingham. A common target was the city's Irish population, which expanded rapidly in the 1950s, partly because of a scheme by Birmingham Transport Department to recruit Irish staff to work on the city's buses, as well as efforts by local factories to entice Irish labourers by offering to provide temporary accommodation and travel expenses. Throughout the 1950s, dozens of Irish immigrants arrived in the city on a weekly basis, often on board the 5:30 a.m. train from Holyhead in Wales, where the ferry from Ireland docked. The size of this population meant that the Birmingham Irish community had become increasingly rooted. Tens of thousands of people attended the annual St Patrick's Day parade following its inaugural procession in 1952, for example. Newspapers like the Irish Press were commonly found in local newsagents, and in Irish pubs, last orders would often be drunk to the sound of traditional Irish ballads like The Wild Colonial Boy. Pubs like the Mermaid on the Stratford Road also began to function as informal job centres for the many Irish men who found casual work as labourers on building sites across Britain. By the end of the century, just as a little side note about that particular pub, The Mermaid pub had been turned into an Indian restaurant, which I think is a very interesting symbol of the changing demographics of that particular area. The ongoing potency of imperial stereotypes regarding the so-called wild Irish meant that the presence of Irish people in neighbourhoods like Balsall Heath chimed with the broader understanding that the dilapidation of the once respectable inner city was intimately connected to its increasingly multicultural profile. This was a trope in media representations of the problem, such as the outcry in autumn 1965 over the reported levels of Irish drunkenness in Birmingham, which centred on the rather dubious finding that more than half of all charges for being drunk and disorderly in the city that year were attributed to people with, quote, Irish-sounding names. Meanwhile, for the authors of a 1967 study of Spark Brook, another inner-city area of Birmingham, a little over a mile away from Balsall Heath and home to some 5,000 Irish immigrants, these prejudices were also a recurring feature of internal community dynamics. English residents there told how the Irish were supposedly riven with sectarian animosity, liable to getting boozed up to their eyeballs and prone to fighting one another in the streets. And such hostilities became even more pronounced with the escalation of the Troubles in the north of Ireland in the 1970s. By this time, with the British Army having been deployed in Northern Ireland and with violence worsening, the IRA embarked on a bombing campaign in England, which, in November 1974, caused 21 people to lose their lives and a further 200 injuries in Birmingham following explosions at 2 city centre pubs. In the aftermath, there were reports of British employees refusing to take shifts with Irish colleagues and shops refusing to stock Irish goods. Indeed, the anti-Irish sentiment that was stirred up by the pub bombings was so intense that the city's annual St. Patrick's Day parade did not take place for the next 22 years. Prior to this, hostility towards the Irish was more accurately an accumulated set of stereotypes and resentments against the social problems that the Irish community was understood to have brought to the city. And in Balsall Heath in the summer of 1968, this became enmeshed with opposition to the presence of some 20 families from the Irish traveller community who had set up camp on a derelict site between Sherborne Road and what would become Birmingham's inner ring road. Irish tinkers, as they were derogatorily referred to, were a growing presence in post-war Britain, where they hoped they might be able to pass for members of the settled Irish community and thus gain a more profitable foothold in the construction and scrap metal industries. In practice, however, what they often found was that they were the victims of hostility from all sides virtually. So from English travellers who resented the additional competition for income, from the settled Irish population whose views on travellers were often informed by the widespread stigmatisation of nomadic communities in Ireland, and from other local residents in Birmingham, as well as the authorities, where there was a racialised view of travellers as being fundamentally untrustworthy, unhygienic, and potentially criminal. In Balsall Heath, the proximity of the traveller camp to a school led to concern among residents that the safety of their children was in jeopardy. In early September 1968, some 250 parents petitioned the City Council stating that they would refuse to send their children to school unless and until the traveller camp was removed. Few travellers were given a platform in the media's coverage of the events, but those who did make themselves heard were at pains to emphasise the impact that discrimination had on the Irish traveller community in particular, but also on members of the Irish community in Britain more generally. One member of the Balsall Heath settlement talked of being hounded around by the authorities. For years now, he said, we've been treated worse than dogs, and it's about time someone realised our need. And in spite of the fact that Irish travellers often spoke in shelter or Irish traveller slang, it also became clear that the settlement in Balsall Heath had grown to include a number of Irish immigrants who were not from the traveller community, but had been forced to join the site due to an inability to find accommodation elsewhere. I have not always lived in a caravan, Jim Maloney, an immigrant from Dublin, was quoted as saying. But if you're a foreigner in this country and have no particular trade to your fingertips, Maloney asked, what else is there? The lengths to which the City Council went to remove the traveller site is, I think, emblematic of how acutely anxieties about the changing in the city were felt in Britain in the late 1960s. and how far this had come to be associated with an outside, supposedly alien presence. On the 15th of September, a convoy of 100 police officers and 50 bailiffs arrived in Balsall Heath and set about forcibly moving the travellers on. The site was cleared in a matter of hours, at which point bulldozers were called upon to dig what was described as an anti-tinker ditch around the site in order to prevent the travellers from returning. It was as if in that late summer of 1968, the removal of the settlement had, in the minds of the authorities, become a test case for their ability to deal with the wider malaise that the inner city was understood to be in. The visibility of this traveller community had, in some respects, put them on a similar plane to the Black and Asian population of Balsall Heath. They had become scapegoats for the neighbourhood's transition from respectable middle-class community to so-called decayed warren of mean and dirty streets. Hostility towards the Irish erupted at particular moments of crisis and was intertwined with the more pervasive issue of having to inhabit what one writer has referred to as the perceptual prison created by the enduring presence of colonial stereotypes about Irishness. But there can be little doubt that it was specifically racial minorities who bore the brunt of community tensions. In the late imperial period, the nature of British racism was marked by a particularly Kafkaesque kind of doublethink. On the one hand, an unquestioned belief in the essential worthiness of the imperial project and a commitment to the racial hierarchies that underpinned it. And on the other, a near absolute refusal to countenance the idea that this same project provided any justification for the Black and Asian citizens of colonised nations to take up residence in the imperial mother country. Decolonisation accelerated in the 1960s. By 1965, nations including Jamaica, Kenya, Malta, and the Gambia had all declared their independence. In this light, and in the context of the changing inner city, the kind of mental gymnastics that had defined the late imperial period had reached near Olympian proportions. In 1965, Associated TV sent the journalist Kenneth Hill to conduct a series of vox pops with residents of what he repeatedly referred to as the Balsall Heath colony. While there, he came across a housewife in her late 20s who reflected that she got on well with the Irish, but had not had much to do with so-called coloured immigrants and would be afraid of ever having to approach one. He interviewed Terry Sotowitz, who was born in Poland, migrated to Britain at the end of the Second World War, and as you can see on the screen there, ran a tailor shop in Balsall Heath. 20 years earlier, the thousands of Polish fighters who had escaped the Nazis by travelling to Britain to volunteer in the war effort were often the focus of hostility from the British-born population, who regularly complained that they believed that the Polish had outstayed their welcome. By 1965, Sotowitz, the Polish tailor, was vocalising similar sentiments towards the ethnically diverse residents of Balsall Heath. He told Hill that he would not like to live where he worked. He didn't think much of the neighbourhood. There were, and I'm quoting here, simply too many coloured faces. Photographs from this period also shed light on the kind of cross-cultural interactions that went against the power-like vision of an immigrant invasion that had, Powell claimed, placed Britain on an irreversible path towards the kind of racial violence being played out in the United States. Photographs like this, I think, get at a process that the cultural theorist Homi Bhabha has referred to as hybridization, the coming together of different cultures, practices, and diasporic traditions, often in the context of very confined geographic spaces like inner cities. In this image, meanwhile, we see a view of a pub, the Wallace Inn pub, on the corner of Longmore Street and Balsall Heath Road. But as you can see, it's juxtaposed against the view from a halal butcher's opposite. So the photograph's taken from inside a halal butcher's. You can probably just make out their halal chickens that have been slaughtered in the traditional halal fashion, hanging upside down. I think what these photographs allow us to get at is an organic, kinetic sense of hybridity in Balsall Heath. I mean, and as with much documentary photography from the period, it was children who acted as a recurring subject for the photographer, filled with that kind of intrigue and a lack of self-consciousness that so often defines the way children behave in front of cameras. I think these photographs testify to the importance of themes like proximity and tactility even for young people in the multicultural inner city. They demonstrate how particularly for its younger residents, cross-cultural interactions were becoming a normal part of the daily navigation of inner city life. So playing on the street, a game of soccer, crossing the road on the way to school. Whatever was going on in parallel to these photographs politically, so we might think about the interventions of Enoch Powell, the introduction of legislation designed to restrict immigration from the former empire, and then even by the end of the 1960s, the growing influence of the neo-Nazi National Front. I think what these photographs show is that alongside those themes, at the level of the street, multicultural interactions had become a near unavoidable feature of inner city life. An important part of these interactions included the establishment of intimate relationships. On both sides of the Irish Sea, the number of women of Irish descent who were embarking on intimate relationships with Black or Asian men was the focus of significant attention. In Britain, this was part of a long-standing racialized anxiety about the implications of a growing population of, to use the language of the day, so-called half-caste children, stretching back all the way to the Second World War, when there was a widespread and intense moral panic about the number of local women who were seemingly embarking on sexual relationships with some of the more than 200,000 African-American troops who, at different points, had been stationed across the UK during the conflict. Opinion poll data regularly showed that the vast majority of the British public were opposed to any form of mixed-race relationship. One survey found that 7 in 10 men agreed with the views of one father whose daughter was in a relationship with a West Indian immigrant. Rather than see her married to a Black man, he declared, I'd rather watch her die having a kid. In Ireland, as the historian Claire Wills has shown, concerns around miscegenation was inseparable from the Catholic Church, and anxieties about the lack of probity shown by young Irish women who were living in concubinage, as the author of one report put it, with men from a range of different nationalities, both in Balsall Heath and in far beyond. On one occasion, a missionary priest had been asked by the concerned family of a young Irish woman to check in with her. In the priest's report back to the family, he recounted how, having found the correct address, the door was opened by, quote, a lovely Irish girl who had in her arms a toddler with a ribbon in her hair. Is the child yours? The priest inquired. The girl admitted that it was. What's its name? The priest asked. Fatima, the girl replied. That's a lovely Catholic name, the priest said. Not at all, the girl countered. It's the name of the Prophet Muhammad's daughter. By the time I started primary school in the area, Balsall Heath had been through various processes of urban renewal. This drastically altered its topography as slum housing was pulled down to be replaced by tower blocks and modern terraced houses. During the 1960s, buildings were literally vanishing from the landscape, signalled by the appearance of shutters on a window or a spray-painted red cross on a building's front door. I think this image gets at the sense of helplessness that residents could sometimes feel at the regeneration process, which was often dictated from the top down and with minimal consultation with the people it would actually affect. We're off after 25 years, a sign on the soon-to-be demolished clothes shop in the photograph reads, you'll miss us, we'll miss you, and they've got us out. In spite of the poor living conditions that made urban regeneration necessary in the first place, residents of working class areas like Balsall Heath often resented being moved away from long-standing community ties and into the modern, better equipped, but somehow cold and lifeless tower blocks or housing estates that have become an increasingly common feature of Britain's cityscapes. The way the processes of urban regeneration played out has been referred to as the slow violence of housing dispossession. Yet, at the same time as this, there was also a parallel, often overlooked process, the extent to which immigrant communities had been undertaking their own changes to the built environment of Britain's inner cities. These were primarily sites of leisure or retail. Immigrant entrepreneurs quickly recognised that if these communities and their descendants were going to be a permanent fixture in neighbourhoods like Balsall Heath, there was money to be made in the provision of goods and services that were simply not being offered elsewhere. Cinemas were particularly important in this respect. The growth in TV ownership in Britain and the arrival in 1955 of a commercial TV channel meant that local cinemas outside city centres increasingly struggled to survive. But in an era before VHF machines, satellite TV, and DVDs, such cinemas could work by catering for the niche but growing demand among South Asian immigrants for films from the golden age of Indian cinema in the years after independence. So what you can see in this photograph is a group of suited and booted men leading one such establishment in Borsall Heath. A similar business model was applied to other areas of the economy. Uncle's Continental Stores, for example, was based at number 78 Highgate Road and established by Santok Singh, a Punjabi immigrant who arrived in Birmingham in 1958. It was one of a growing number of shops that were opened across the 1950s and 60s in order to meet the demand for garam masala, ghee and other foodstuffs essential to Asian cuisine, but simply unavailable in mainstream establishments. And then there were the cafes, the two most popular of which in Borsall Heath were situated on the Clevedon Road, less than a mile away from Uncle's, the Kashmir Coffee Bar and the Pyar Ka Cigar Cafe and Restaurant. The way in which these spaces operated in the 1960s, long before going for an Indian became such a mainstay of the culinary lives of white diners, was wide-ranging. This is made particularly clear by Emigre Journeys, a novel by the Pakistani writer Abdullah Hussain, who was one of the earliest writers to seek to evoke the experiences of working-class Muslims in Britain, and drew upon his own experiences of migrating to Britain in his mid-30s in 1966. In the novel, cafes are depicted as key community hubs, places where people meet up to pass the time and collect information about how it was possible to make a living in Britain. They stayed open late so that men working lengthy hours would have a place to go for a cheap meal after a shift. They functioned as both the first point of call for new arrivals in Birmingham, as well as places where you could listen to songs from Indian films, ghazals or poems, or qawwalis or devotional religious songs. In Hussein's telling, cinemas occupied an even more privileged position. They come across as providing cinemas with a near spiritual connection to their homes in the Indian subcontinent that took on further significance in the context of the alienation many people felt in Britain. Like being at a mosque or temple, the cinema was a place where you became a different version of yourself. You packed a bag full of parathas, polished your shoes, and, in defiance of any stares you might get from white passers-by, you wore your shalwar kameez, your kurta, your chadar, your turban, your lungi, and anything else that you might have been too afraid to wear during the working week. While at the cinema, Hussain wrote in Emigre Journeys, the on-screen sight of our actors and actresses, our jokes, romantic stories, the scenery of our land, the culture of our dreams, simultaneously entertained and wretched our souls. Once the film had finished and the lights went on, Hussein's narrator, engulfed with emotion, would often forget where he was. It was an experience enough to make grown men cry, Hussain wrote, as if suffering from a terrible disease. By the end of the 1960s, one writer estimated that there were 200 Asian-run cinemas across the country and that the industry was worth over £1 million a year. For one Asian immigrant, it was the separateness of such spaces from white society that was their most important characteristic. People just wanted to go where they could talk in their own language, he said, rather than going to learn how to pronounce English to a Gora or white person. But I think, as these images suggest, when it comes to cafes like the Kashmir and the Pyar Ka Cigar, this didn't preclude them from having a mixed clientele. Such establishments provided the backdrop to points of interaction between different segments of the neighbourhood, in the small talk in the queue to order, for example, or over a shared joke at a cramped table in the wait for it to arrive. Certainly, by the late 1960s, these businesses were projecting a greater degree of cultural assertiveness among Borsall Heath South Asian communities in particular. In the early 1960s, the owner of the Pyar Ka Cigar Cafe had hired Kafait Shah, a Lahore-born artist, to paint a series of murals both inside and outside the cafe, based on scenes from the 1961 Indian film from which the cafe had taken its name. Shah arrived in Birmingham in 1965, and like many South Asian men, initially earned his living at a Black Country foundry, an industry which by the 1960s had become increasingly reliant on Asian labour. But as his artistic reputation grew, Shah found that he was in demand for commissions from cafes, cinemas, restaurants, and other immigrant-run establishments. Shah claimed that his paintings from the Pyar Ka Cigar, which you can see on the screen there, for a time, helped make the cafe famous enough that people would come to visit from outside the area. And as you can hopefully see, his work is indeed incredibly striking. Like the large lettering on the signs of the Kashmir Cafe, or the poster outside the cinema that we just saw, advertising the showtimes for a film called Upkar, 1967 movie about the India-Pakistan war. What I think is noteworthy about Shah's work for the Pyar Ka Cigar is its visibility. Uncle's, Kashmir, and other establishments were, of course, themselves temporary and under threat, not least from the process of slum clearance. But their presence also projects an entirely different message to "they've got us out." Rather, these establishments are indicative of an increasing level of cultural self-confidence and a community inserting itself into Balsall Heath's fabric. I've talked a lot about the 1960s today because that was the decade to which I think we can trace the origins of the eventual emergence of the hybridized identities that have, in spite of the periodic rise and influence of the far right, become an established feature of modern Britain. So I'm talking about identities like Black British, British Asian, British Muslim, etc. The Irish have occupied a really complex position in this process. Many second and third generation descendants of Irish immigrants were part of the wave of white people who left areas like Balsall Heath as migrants from other formerly colonised nations moved in, a process often referred to by sociologists as white flight. Notwithstanding the perceptual prism created by the enduring presence of colonial era stereotypes about Irishness, many Irish migrants have assimilated into broader categories of white Britishness, while in cities like Birmingham and Manchester, there was also a turn inwards that was prompted by the Troubles in general and the IRA bombing campaign in Britain in particular. But I think we should also recognise the extent to which many Irish migrants were at the heart of some of the earliest sites of street-level multiculturalism in Britain, as next-door neighbours, school friends, co-workers, or lovers. As one respondent from Birmingham explained in the early 2000s, when she was asked to describe the nature of her own identity, "Frig me," she said. "I live in England, Mum's from Ireland, my granddad's from Ireland, my bleeding dad's from Jamaica. In my family, you've got everybody." This kind of proximity to diversity and diaspora has, in spite of the polarised nature of the British political debate and the enduringly potent nature of racism and xenophobia, become a commonplace feature of people's social experience and identities in modern Britain. For example, more than 30% of all babies born in England and Wales in 2015 had at least one foreign-born parent, and 20% of people identified with an ethnicity other than white British. And I think that proportion probably masked the significant number of people who would likely have ticked the white British box at the census, whilst also having, ancestral ties to places like Greece, Germany, and indeed maybe even Ireland as well. By 2021, more than a third of the population of England were either migrants themselves or else had parents or grandparents like myself born outside of the UK. And 10 million people, almost 17% of the population as a whole, had been born overseas. It has long since ceased to be possible for the diasporic traditions of people with elsewhere in their blood, as the novelist Guy Gunaratne has put it, to be boxed off from mainstream Britain. After cultural diversity, the very concept of Britishness cannot be what it was before. Right now, as we're talking today, with 20% of the population having been born overseas, Ireland is, I think, in the midst of its own extraordinary turning point. The term diaspora is in the process of taking on a whole new meaning as a diverse domestic entity reshaped by people who have come to Ireland rather than by the absence of those who have left it behind. Operating in parallel to the emergence of a small but vocal far right, the relationships that are right now developing in Ireland's streets, in its cafes, school playgrounds, backyards and workplaces are paving the way for what one day we might see as the making of multicultural Ireland. Thank you so much for your time.